Medical workers of Reddit, what were the most haunting last words you've heard from a patient? Paramedic here. I was transporting a cardiac patient, and while we were both watching my EKG monitor, he went into VFIB, a lethal heart rhythm. His heart stopped pumping blood effectively at that point, but there was enough blood pressure for a few seconds of consciousness. He looked at me and said, "But I don't see the light," and went unconscious. Coded him, shocked him a few times. Meds by the handful, but he died. I'm going home tonight, so I won't see you tomorrow. Bye. Damn if she wasn't right. Nurse. In hospital caring for 40-ish man with brain tumor, coming in and out of consciousness, not to be resuscitated. His 16-year-old daughter was crying non-stop for 12 hours. His wife, who had been given a few months to prepare herself, was calm and focused on her husband. I had to routinely check his level of consciousness, which involved talking to him in a loud voice, responds to auditory stimulation, which I did not like to do, so I asked his wife to do the loud voice part, so the voice he would hear would be hers, not mine, and she did so without hesitation. The only response we observed with her vocalization made this, by now profoundly unconscious, patient take her hand to his lips and kiss it. He stopped breathing very soon after that. I am haunted, but not in a bad way. It wasn't words. But the most haunting death was a patient who was DNR. Through her and her family's wishes, she was losing her battle, and her family wasn't there. She was getting frantic and looking around and half sitting up in bed, and a nurse with more experience than me took her hand and calmly said, "It's okay, you're not alone. We're right here with you. It's okay to leave." The patient immediately calmed, put her head back on the pillow and died. I knew I wanted to be that nurse when I grew up. How the hell did she know just what to do and say? I've never forgotten it. Not a medical worker, but my friend's husband was dying from cancer. He'd done lots of chemo and one surgery, and overall his prognoses looked really good. He'd gone through another surgery, and he was due to be released from the hospital a couple days after this story takes place. My friend had been with him and was going back home to sleep for the night. Just before she left his room, he said, "I'm going to miss you, my love," and obviously she thinks nothing of it, saying, "I'll miss you too. I'll be back in the morning." Couple hours later he was gone. Not the very last words. But I had a patient in her early 20s who was severely thrombocytopenic and bleeding profusely for days ask me if she was going to make it. I had to look her in the eyes and tell her there is a good chance she wouldn't. I thought she would bust into tears, but no, she just kind of sat back and accepted it. I think she already knew. She died shortly after I got off shift. I'm gonna yell up, old man who never attended his dialysis appointments. A few hours later we had a fire right by his former room, so despite not being all that worrying at the time, he definitely was the only one that followed through on actually haunting us. Not a medical worker, but I went with my father to say goodbye to my great-uncle, his uncle. He was suffering from dementia and clearly on the way out. He no longer recognized people. My father was an only child, and spent most of his time being raised by his uncles, as his father ran a farm all day. Anyway, we're sitting there, and great-uncle is snoozing. He suddenly wakes up and clearly sees my father and starts talking to him about a barn and describing it in great detail, like, he's talking about where it is, the way the paint was flaking off in one corner, and so on. My father is quieter than normal and just saying yes over and over as he describes the barn. Then, just before great-uncle loses consciousness, he describes going into the barn and setting it on fire. Turns out that my grandfather and great-uncle were having a hell of a dispute at one time and burned down the barn to get back at him. Everyone suspected, but never knew for sure. Edit. Looks like I forgot the last words, most of them were mumbles. But he spoke about how the fire lit up the night and how it took a while to catch. I was visiting my grandpa and had to leave town and go back to medical school, and I told him I loved him and would see him later. He told me he loved me too, but no, I wouldn't. He was right. He died a week later of pneumonia. With wide eyes. Don't listen to my family. They want to keep me around forever, but I just want to die. They won't let me. Edit. She wanted to get off dialysis, which was a death sentence for her. My pop died of lung cancer. The last lucid thing he did was wake up just long enough to sing "Show Me the Way to Go Home." I'm tired and I want to go to bed. I had a little drink about an hour ago and it went right to my head. It was really pretty amazing and freaky at the same time. Cancer. During my residency I was on call and running the hospital, as senior residents tend to do. One of my responsibilities was being in charge of the entire ICU, which had about 16 to 20 bed capacity. I was taking care of a man who had a bowel perforation, a hole in his intestines. He had a nasogastric tube up his nose into his stomach so that he wouldn't drown in his own feces. His brother and sister-in-law came to visit him and they had a nice conversation. I walked in as they were leaving and they said to him, "Make sure to listen to the doctor," as they left. The patient and I talked a bit and he wasn't looking so good. I kept hearing a gargling sound as he was speaking to me. The kind of sound you make when you rinse out your mouth with mouthwash and spit it out. I immediately checked his ink tube and it came right out. He looked at me and said I shouldn't have played with the tube, before going pale and losing a pulse. I did everything in my power to save him that day, but his lungs were full of stool and he died 20 minutes later. The rest of the day I felt utterly numb and it still sits with me to this day. To have a patient smiling and laughing with you one moment, then being deceased 20 minutes later is one hell of a roller coaster ride. I was about 5 or 6 when my grandfather was on his deathbed. The last thing he did was put his hand on my shoulder and said, "No wonder you never liked my spicy food." And then he passed about 10 seconds later. We were all super confused. About 3 months later I almost died from suffocation after eating some salsa. At the hospital I was diagnosed with a capsaicin allergy, spicy food. To this day it still creeps me out. No one knew I was allergic before then, and I didn't show any signs either. I'm an EMT. Had a patient say I don't feel so good right before they dropped dead of a massive heart attack. It was just the matter-of-fact way they said it. When I was training I had a guy go into a massive cardiac arrest. We ended up working on him for over an hour and a half because we kept getting him back then losing him again. He had wet himself during the arrest, which is common. It happens, and he just kept apologizing for making a mess. Had a patient that kept coding, "Heart stopped breathing," but every time they came back they'd get crazy strong, fight everyone, and then start saying the Lord's Prayer. They'd trail off and code again. Another one snatched me by the arm and pleaded that they wanted to see their baby grow up. 60 seconds later I was pumping away on the chest. In my line of work I hear a lot of last words. These two though surprisingly weren't the final last words. I just thought they were, and at the time it was a perfectly rational thought. Of last words my favorites were always the "I want you to go away and leave me alone. I'm going to sleep. Goodbye." Family members didn't pick up on that one, but that patient and his eyes said it all. I'm an emergency nurse. And there's one thing that always gets me when patients die, not what they say, but what their husband, wife, parents say when they've gone. I've had it a few times, but the most memorable was a man in his 70s whose wife had just passed away, and he was holding her hand and crying, and he just looked up at me and said, "I've loved her for 55 years. She's my whole life. What do I do without her? It breaks me every time." Wasn't his last words, but last words he said to me. I am an EMT, and we had a frequent patient, almost once a week. He was a huge but towards the end he turned into a sweet and appreciative man. We were in his house, which what ended up being our last day there. He knew it. I didn't. He said, "Can I just have a beer before we leave for the hospital?" I didn't let him have it. I should have. "Student sir, are you in any pain?" Patient: "The kind of dumbass question is that I just got stabbed." "Yeah, I'm in pain." He died within minutes. Had a patient on the cardiac ICU during my second month of intern year who had newly diagnosed heart failure that we couldn't figure out what caused it. He was a healthy guy, in his 60s, did yoga every day, walked a few miles 5 days a week, Genuinely nice guy, which is always a bad prognostic sign. With his heart failure, his heart was so stretched out and not squeezing adequately to provide the blood and subsequent oxygen he needs to the rest of his body. A few nights into his hospital stay, I come in the next morning and discovered that the senior resident had to code him for sustained unstable heart arrhythmia, unstable VTAC. I went and talked with him about it the next morning, and he told me that he was in and out of consciousness during it all from the low blood pressure, but he compared it to the feeling of jumping out of the plane and skydiving. Later that morning I was checking on him again and he didn't look so good. He goes into the arrhythmia again, drops his blood pressure, and is in and out of consciousness. As I'm charging the defibrillator to shock him again, he comes back around too and briefly and asks me if I'm taking him skydiving again and lets out a nervous laugh before losing consciousness.